8-year-old April Tinsley left her Fort Wayne, Indiana home on April 1, 1888 to walk to a friend's house just a few blocks away. She never arrived at that destination. 3 days later, her body would be found in a ditch 20 miles from home. What followed was an investigation that would span 3 decades, include disturbing messages from the killer, and eventually require cutting-edge DNA technology to solve. If you want to see how investigators finally solved this decades-old mystery, subscribe to the channel. April Marie Tinsley lived with her family in Fort Wayne, a city in northeastern Indiana with a population of approximately 200,000 people. The 8-year-old girl was known in her neighborhood as an active child who enjoyed playing outside and spending time with friends. On April 1, 1988, Good Friday, April asked her mother if she could walk to a friend's house located just a few blocks away from their residence on West Williams Street. Her mother, Janet Tinsley, gave permission for the short walk. The destination was close enough that April had made the trip before without incident. Fort Wayne in 1988 was a community where children routinely played outside and walked to nearby houses without constant adult supervision. The neighborhood where April lived was residential and familiar to the family. April left her home and began walking toward her friend's house. The route was straightforward and involved traveling through the neighborhood on streets she knew. The time was late afternoon, with sufficient daylight remaining for the walk. April was expected to arrive at her friend's house within minutes given the short distance between the two locations. When April failed to arrive at her friend's house, concern began to build. The friend's family contacted the Tinsley family to ask if April had left or if plans had changed. Janet Tinsley confirmed that April had departed from their home and should have reached the destination. The realization that April had not completed the short walk triggered immediate alarm. The Tinsley family began searching the neighborhood. They walked the route April would have taken, looking for any sign of her or anyone who might have seen her. Family members knocked on doors and asked neighbors if they had observed April walking past their homes. The search expanded as relatives and friends joined the effort to locate the missing girl. Fort Wayne police were notified that April Tinsley had disappeared while walking between 2 houses in the neighborhood. Officers responded to begin an official missing persons investigation. Police interviewed family members to establish a timeline of April's departure and her intended destination. They spoke with neighbors along the route to determine if anyone had seen April or noticed anything unusual during the relevant time frame. The search intensified as darkness fell. Police organized search parties to cover the neighborhood systematically. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in looking for April. The search included checking yards, alleys, and any location where a child might be found. Flashlights swept through the area as searchers called April's name. News of the missing girl spread quickly through Fort Wayne. Local media reported April's disappearance, broadcasting her description and photograph to the wider community. The coverage asked anyone with information about April's whereabouts to contact police immediately. The case received significant attention as Fort Wayne residents became aware that a child had vanished while walking just a few blocks in broad daylight. The search continued through the night and into the next day. Police expanded the search radius beyond the immediate neighborhood. Additional officers and volunteers joined the effort. The Fort Wayne community responded with support for the Tinsley family and determination to find April. Churches and community organizations coordinated volunteer efforts and provided resources for the search. As hours turned into days, the fear for April's safety grew more acute. The fact that she had disappeared during such a short walk in familiar surroundings made the situation even more troubling. There was no indication that April had planned to run away or go anywhere other than her friend's house. Her complete disappearance without any witnesses or clear explanation created a mystery that consumed the attention of law enforcement and the community. On April 4, 1988, a jogger running along a rural road in DeKalb County made a discovery that would end the search for April Tinsley. The jogger found a child's body in a ditch approximately 20 miles from Fort Wayne. The location was rural and isolated, far removed from the Fort Wayne neighborhood where April had disappeared 3 days earlier. Law enforcement responded to the scene. Officers from DeKalb County Sheriff's Department secured the area and began processing what was clearly a crime scene. The body was identified as April Marie Tinsley through physical characteristics and clothing. The 8-year-old had been found in a ditch along County Road 68, a remote location that required someone with a vehicle to transport her body from Fort Wayne. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. The examination revealed that April died from asphyxiation. The autopsy also documented evidence of sexual assault. Forensic examiners collected biological evidence from April's body and clothing, including DNA material from her underwear. The evidence was preserved and documented according to standard protocols for criminal investigations. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The findings meant that April had been intentionally killed by another person. The sexual assault documentation established that the crime involved not just murder but also a violent attack on a child. The evidence collected during the autopsy would become central to the investigation and eventual prosecution. Fort Wayne police and DeKalb County authorities coordinated their investigative efforts. The disappearance had occurred in Fort Wayne while the body was discovered in DeKalb County, requiring cooperation between jurisdictions. Detectives began working to establish a timeline of events between April's disappearance on April 1st and the discovery of her body on April 4th. Investigators conducted extensive interviews with residents in both Fort Wayne and the rural area where April's body was found. They spoke with people who lived along County Road 68 to determine if anyone had seen vehicles or suspicious activity in the days leading up to the discovery. They re-interviewed Fort Wayne neighbors to identify anyone who might have seen April being approached or taken on April 1st. The DNA evidence collected from the crime scene was analyzed by forensic laboratories. In 1988, DNA technology was relatively new in criminal investigations but advancing rapidly. The biological evidence from April's underwear was processed to develop a DNA profile of the perpetrator. The profile would be entered into databases and compared against known offenders, though the technology and databases available in 1988 were far more limited than what would exist in later decades. Police developed a suspect profile based on the nature of the crime. The sexual assault and murder of a child indicated a particular type of offender. Investigators looked at known sex offenders in the Fort Wayne area and surrounding communities. They examined anyone with a history of crimes against children or violent sexual offenses. Each potential suspect was investigated and either eliminated or remained on a list for further scrutiny. The Fort Wayne community reacted with shock and grief to the confirmation that April had been killed. The discovery of her body transformed the missing person case into a murder investigation. Parents throughout Fort Wayne became more vigilant about their children's whereabouts. The sense of safety that had allowed children to walk freely through neighborhoods was shattered by the realization that a child predator had struck in their community. Janet Tinsley and her family faced the devastating reality of April's death. The hope that April might be found alive ended with the discovery in DeKalb County. The family now had to process not just the loss of April, but the violent circumstances of her death. The knowledge that April had been assaulted and murdered added layers of trauma to their grief. The investigation became a priority for Fort Wayne police. Detectives assigned to the case worked to identify any leads that might point toward a suspect. The evidence collected at the scene and during the autopsy provided scientific material for analysis, but without a matching suspect, the DNA profile remained an identifier without a name attached to it. In May 1990, more than 2 years after April Tinsley's murder, law enforcement officers discovered a disturbing message written on a barn door in DeKalb County. The barn was located not far from where April's body had been found in April 1988. The message appeared to be written in pencil or crayon, scrolled across the wooden door in crude lettering. The message read, "I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley. I will kill again." The misspelling of April's last name and the word "again" indicated either genuine illiteracy or a deliberate attempt to disguise the writer's identity. The content of the message was clear. claiming responsibility for April's death and threatening to kill another child. The discovery of the message reignited the investigation that had grown cold in the 2 years since April's murder. Fort Wayne police and the Cobb County authorities examined the barn and the surrounding area for any additional evidence. The message itself became a piece of evidence, photographed and documented before any attempt was made to preserve or remove it. Investigators analyzed the handwriting and the materials used to write the message. The location of the message was significant. The barn sat in the same rural area where April's body had been discovered, suggesting the perpetrator had returned to the vicinity of the crime scene. Whether the person had maintained some connection to the area or simply returned to leave the message became a question for investigators to consider. The threatening nature of the message created fear throughout the Fort Wayne community. The claim that the killer would strike again meant that other children might be at risk. Parents who had already become more protective of their children after April's murder now faced renewed anxiety. The message demonstrated that the person responsible for April's death was still out there and apparently willing to communicate with authorities. Law enforcement appealed to the public for any information about who might have written the message or been seen near the barn. Investigators hoped someone had noticed unusual activity in the area around the time the message appeared. They examined whether anyone living or working near the barn had observed vehicles or individuals that seemed out of place. The FBI became involved in analyzing the case. Federal resources were brought to bear on both the original murder investigation and the new development with the barn message. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit examined the profile of someone who would kill a child and then return to taunt authorities years later. The message suggested a perpetrator who wanted attention or who derived satisfaction from knowing the crime remained unsolved. Despite the renewed investigative efforts, no immediate suspect emerged from the barn message. The writing did not match any known samples. No witnesses came forward with information about who might have been near the barn. The message became another piece of the investigative puzzle, documented and preserved, but not immediately leading to an arrest. The years continued to pass without resolution. The barn message served as a reminder that April's killer remained free, but it did not provide the breakthrough investigators needed to identify a specific individual. The DNA evidence from the crime scene remained the most concrete physical evidence available, waiting for technological advances or a database match that might finally connect the profile to a name. In the spring of 2004, 16 years after April Tinsley's murder, the killer made contact again. 4 separate notes appeared at different residences in the Fort Wayne area. The notes were not sent through the mail or delivered directly to police, but were left at homes where young girls lived. The placement of the notes at houses with children demonstrated that the perpetrator had been observing these families and knew their routines. The notes were found in plastic bags left on bicycles that young girls had left in their yards. The discovery locations were spread across Fort Wayne, indicating the person had traveled to multiple neighborhoods. Each note contained similar wording and disturbing content that referenced April's murder and threatened future violence. The messages read, "Hi honey, I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped and rape and kill April Tinsley. You are my next victim." The misspellings and grammatical errors matched the pattern from the 1990 barn message. The direct threat to the girls at whose homes the notes were left created immediate alarm among families and law enforcement. Inside the plastic bags with the notes were used condoms. The inclusion of these items was deliberate, providing biological evidence that could be analyzed for DNA. Additionally, some of the bags contained Polaroid photographs showing the lower portion of a male body from the waist down. The photographs did not show the person's face, but appeared to be self-taken images intended to further intimidate and demonstrate the perpetrator's identity as someone who had committed sexual crimes. Fort Wayne police collected all 4 notes, the used condoms, and the photographs as evidence. The items were processed by forensic laboratories to extract DNA from the biological material on the condoms. The DNA analysis revealed that the genetic profile from the 2004 condoms was consistent with the DNA recovered from April's underwear in 1988. The match confirmed that the same person who killed April was now leaving these threatening messages at homes throughout Fort Wayne. The consistency of the DNA evidence across 16 years provided investigators with certainty that they were dealing with the same perpetrator. The person had maintained enough control and awareness to avoid detection for nearly 2 decades, while also feeling compelled to reach out and taunt authorities. The behavioral pattern suggested someone who derived satisfaction from the fear created by the unsolved crime. Fort Wayne police analyzed the choice of homes where the notes were left. The selection of residences with young girls indicated the perpetrator had been surveilling these families. Investigators worked to determine if there was any connection between the targeted homes, or if the selection was random within certain neighborhoods. They examined whether the person might live or work in the areas where the notes appeared. A profile of the suspect was developed based on the evidence and behavioral analysis. Investigators believed they were looking for a white male who worked, lived, or spent time in the northeast section of Fort Wayne. The profile suggested someone who would be in locations where groups of children, especially young girls, were likely to be present. The person might collect toys or items that would be of interest to young girls, using such items as a way to gain proximity to potential victims. The 2004 incidents created renewed public attention on April's unsolved murder. The Fort Wayne community had not forgotten the 8-year-old girl killed in 1988, but the threatening notes brought the cold case back into immediate focus. Parents became hypervigilant about their children's safety. Schools and community organizations increased awareness about stranger danger and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. Despite the new evidence and renewed investigative efforts, authorities still could not identify a specific suspect. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system that maintains profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crime scenes. No match was found in the database, indicating that the perpetrator had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA submission or had committed the murder before such requirements were in place. Investigators continued pursuing leads generated by the 2004 incidents. They interviewed registered sex offenders in the Fort Wayne area. They examined anyone with a history of crimes against children. In October 2004, a convicted sex offender was questioned extensively about the case and brought in for DNA testing. His profile did not match the evidence from the crime scene, and he was eliminated as a suspect. The investigation remained active, but without the breakthrough needed to make an arrest. The DNA evidence provided a genetic fingerprint of the killer, but without a name to attach to that profile, the case stayed unsolved. Detective Dan Camp became one of the lead investigators assigned to April Tinsley's murder in 1988. The case consumed his professional life for years as he pursued hundreds of leads and interviewed countless potential witnesses. Camp carried April's photograph in his wallet, a constant reminder of the child whose killer remained unidentified. The detective reviewed the evidence repeatedly, believing that somewhere in the accumulated information was a detail he had missed. The pressure of working an unsolved child murder case took its toll. Camp told colleagues that he felt responsible for finding April's killer, and the inability to solve the case weighed on him personally. He went over the evidence again and again, trying to identify the missing piece that would break the investigation open. The obsessive nature of his work on the case eventually led Camp to transfer out of the detective bureau, unable to continue bearing the burden of the unsolved homicide. Other detectives took over the investigation as Camp moved to different assignments. The case file grew thicker with documentation from years of investigative work, but no arrest materialized. The DNA evidence remained the strongest physical link to the perpetrator, yet it sat unused without a matching profile to compare against. In 2009, the FBI formally joined the investigation into April's murder. Federal agents brought additional resources and expertise to the cold case. The FBI publicly stated that they considered April's murder highly solvable, expressing confidence that advances in forensic technology and investigative techniques could lead to identifying the killer. The FBI's involvement brought renewed attention to the case and signaled that law enforcement remained committed to finding answers despite more than 2 decades passing since April's death. In 2015, investigators took advantage of new DNA phenotyping technology, a sophisticated computer program developed by a Virginia laboratory analyzed the DNA evidence from the crime scene to create a composite image of what the suspect might look like. The technology used genetic markers to predict physical characteristics, including facial features, skin tone, eye color, and hair color. The resulting composite sketch showed a white male with specific facial features, providing the public with a visual representation of the possible killer. The composite was updated in 2016 to show what the suspect might look like at that current time, accounting for aging since 1988. The updated image depicted a man in his late 50s or early 60s, reflecting the passage of nearly 3 decades since April's murder. The age-progressed composite was distributed to media outlets and posted on law enforcement websites, asking the public to come forward if they recognized the person. The phenotyping results reinforced the investigative profile that had been developed over the years. The suspect was believed to be a white male, currently between the ages of 49 and 59 in 2009. The profile indicated he worked, lived, or spent time in the northeast section of Fort Wayne. Behavioral analysts suggested he likely spent time in locations where groups of children, especially young girls, would be present. In 2018, Indiana enacted a new law designed to help solve cold cases like April's murder. Beginning January 1st, anyone arrested for a felony crime in Indiana was required to submit a DNA sample via cheek swab. The samples would be entered into the state's combined DNA index system, expanding the database available for comparison against unsolved crime scene evidence. The legislation represented an effort to use modern forensic science to address cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The Annequan community never forgot April. Her case remained part of the collective memory, a tragedy that had never received resolution. Local media periodically featured stories about the unsolved murder, keeping public attention on the case. April's mother, Janet Tinsley, continued to speak publicly about her daughter and the ongoing search for justice, maintaining hope that someday the person responsible would be identified and held accountable. As the 30-year anniversary of April's murder approached in 2018, the investigation stood at a crossroads. Investigators had DNA evidence, behavioral profiles, composite sketches, and decades of accumulated investigative work. What they still lacked was the one element that could transform all that information into an arrest: the identity of the person whose DNA matched the evidence from the crime scene. In May 2018, Fort Wayne Police Detective Brian Martin made a decision that would change the trajectory of April Tinsley's investigation. Just 2 weeks after police in California used genetic genealogy to arrest the Golden State Killer, Martin arranged for similar testing to be conducted on the DNA evidence from April's case. The successful resolution of the Golden State Killer case had demonstrated the power of combining traditional DNA analysis with public genealogy databases, opening new possibilities for cold cases across the country. Detective Martin contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology company based in Virginia that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. The company had developed expertise in using DNA evidence from crime scenes to identify suspects through family connections rather than direct matches in criminal databases. The approach represented a fundamental shift in how DNA could be used in criminal investigations. The process began with the DNA profile that had been developed from the biological evidence collected in 1988 and from the used condoms left in 2004. Forensic scientists at Parabon took that genetic profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily submit their DNA information to explore their ancestry and find relatives. Unlike CODIS, which contains profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes, GEDmatch held genetic information from ordinary citizens interested in family history. The database search identified individuals who shared DNA with the unknown suspect. These were not exact matches, but rather genetic relatives at varying degrees of separation. The shared DNA indicated common ancestors somewhere in the family tree, even if those ancestors lived generations in the past. A person might share enough DNA to be a second cousin, third cousin, or even more distant relation to the suspect. Professional genealogists at Paragon began the painstaking work of building family trees based on the DNA matches. They used traditional genealogical research methods, examining birth records, marriage certificates, death records, census data, and other historical documents. The genealogists traced lineages backward to identify common ancestors and then worked forward through subsequent generations, mapping out all descendants. The process created comprehensive family trees that included hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. The genealogical work took weeks of dedicated effort. Researchers had to verify relationships, account for adoptions and name changes, and track families as they moved across different locations. The DNA matches provided clues about which branches of the family trees were most relevant, allowing genealogists to focus their research on the most promising lines of descent. By July 2, 2018, the genetic genealogy analysis had narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. The work had identified 2 brothers who fit the genetic profile and the demographic characteristics developed over decades of investigation. Both men were the right age, lived in the geographic area connected to the crime, and shared the genetic markers found in the crime scene evidence. Fort Wayne police now faced a crucial decision. They had narrowed a decades-old cold case to 2 specific individuals through genetic genealogy, but they needed direct DNA samples from these men to confirm which one, if either, was actually the perpetrator. Approaching the men directly and requesting voluntary DNA samples risked alerting a potential killer and possibly causing him to flee or destroy evidence. Investigators chose to conduct surveillance operations. Detectives began monitoring one of the brothers, John D. Miller, who lived in Grayville, Indiana, a small town northeast of Fort Wayne. The surveillance was discreet, designed to observe Miller's movements and routines without his knowledge. The goal was to obtain a DNA sample through legal means that would not require Miller's cooperation or awareness. The opportunity came through trash collection. Under established legal principles, items that people discard and place in trash receptacles for collection are considered abandoned property. Law enforcement can collect and examine such items without a warrant because there is no expectation of privacy once something has been thrown away for disposal. Surveillance officers watched Miller's residence and waited for trash collection days. When Miller placed garbage at the curb for pickup, investigators retrieved the bags before the Waste Management Service collected them. The team carefully documented the chain of custody to ensure the evidence would be admissible in court proceedings. Inside the trash, investigators found 3 used condoms. The items were sent to forensic laboratories for DNA extraction and analysis. Technicians developed a DNA profile from the biological material on the condoms and compared it to the profile from the crime scene evidence collected in 1988 and in 2004. The laboratory analysis confirmed a match. The DNA from the condoms in Miller's trash was consistent with the DNA from April's underwear and from the condoms left with the threatening notes in 2004. After 30 years, investigators had identified the person whose genetic profile matched the evidence from April's murder. On Sunday morning, July 15, 2018, Fort Wayne police officers and U.S. Marshals approached a residence in Grayville, Indiana. The small town northeast of Fort Wayne had a population of approximately 1,000 people. The home belonged to John D. Miller, a 59-year-old man who had lived in the community for years. Neighbors knew him as a quiet resident who had previously worked at Walmart. The officers were there to question Miller about April Tinsley's murder. When authorities knocked on Miller's door, he agreed to speak with them. The officers asked Miller if he would come to the Fort Wayne Police Department for an interview. Miller consented and was transported to the police station. At the department, detectives read Miller his rights, and he indicated he understood them. He agreed to answer questions without requesting an attorney. Detectives began the interview by asking Miller if he knew why police wanted to talk to him. Miller's response was immediate and direct. He said, "April Tinsley." The answer indicated that Miller immediately understood the purpose of the interview and connected it to the 30-year-old murder case. His unprompted mention of April's name suggested awareness of his connection to the crime. During the interrogation, Miller provided a confession to detectives. He admitted that he had abducted April on April 1, 1888. Miller confessed to causing April's death and to disposing of her body in the DeKalb County ditch where it was found on April 4. The confession provided investigators with direct admissions to the major elements of the charges against him. The confession corroborated the physical evidence that had led investigators to Miller. The DNA match from the trash had identified him as a suspect, and his statements during the interview confirmed his involvement in the crimes. The combination of forensic evidence and confession gave prosecutors a strong case for formal charges. Miller was arrested and charged with murder, child molesting, and criminal confinement. The charges reflected the criminal acts documented in the investigation. The preliminary charges would be followed by formal charges once prosecutors had reviewed all the evidence and prepared the case for court proceedings. News of the arrest spread quickly through Fort Wayne and the surrounding communities. The 30-year-old cold case that had haunted the city finally had a suspect in custody. Media outlets reported the arrest, identifying Miller and providing details about how genetic genealogy had led to his identification. The story attracted national attention as another example of how advances in DNA technology were solving decades-old cold cases. Neighbors in Graybill expressed shock upon learning that Miller had been arrested for April's murder. The quiet community had no indication that the man living among them was connected to one of the region's most notorious unsolved crimes. Miller's home was located across from a Little League softball field where children played regularly. Kids walked past his residence on their way to the school bus stop. The proximity to children took on disturbing significance given the nature of the charges against him. One of Miller's brothers spoke to local media after the arrest. The brother, who was not identified by name, said he was shocked and disturbed by the allegations. He stated that when he learned Miller had confessed to the crime, his brother died to him. The brother described Miller as fairly quiet, but noted he had a short temper. He told reporters that whatever punishment Miller received, he deserved it, and expressed a wish that Miller had been caught decades earlier. Former Detective Dan Camp, who had worked the case obsessively for years before transferring out of the Detective Bureau, learned of the arrest with relief and vindication. Camp told media outlets he was elated after 30 exhausting years. He noted that the profile investigators had developed of the likely killer matched what John Miller looked like and his characteristics. Camp said he thought about April often and had carried her picture in his wallet for a long time. He expressed his intention to attend Miller's trial proceedings. Allen County prosecutor Karen Richards spoke at a news conference about the arrest. She stated that the case had haunted the community for 30 years and that the family had waited 3 decades for answers. Richards praised the work of investigators across multiple agencies and generations of detectives who had preserved evidence and maintained the investigation. She noted that without the initial investigators properly collecting and preserving DNA evidence in 1988, the arrest in 2018 would not have been possible. Fort Wayne Police Chief Steve Reed joined other officials at the news conference, expressing hope that the arrest would bring some measure of closure and peace to April's family after 3 decades of waiting. Indiana State Police Sergeant Ron Galalvez stated that the resolution was possible because of the hard work and dedication of the initial investigators who preserved information that became evidence in the case. On December 21, 2018, John D. Miller appeared in court to enter a plea in the charges against him. Miller had been in custody since his July arrest, held without bond as the legal proceedings moved forward. The courtroom in Fort Wayne was packed for the hearing, with nearly every seat filled and several people standing in the back half of the room. The high level of public interest reflected the significance of the case to the Fort Wayne community. Miller was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair. His physical condition had apparently deteriorated during the months since his arrest. He spoke only once during the proceedings, stating his name when asked by the judge. His voice was described as strong but shaky, reflecting either physical ailment or the emotional weight of the moment. Miller entered a guilty plea to the charges against him. By pleading guilty, he admitted legal responsibility for April Tinsley's murder and sexual assault. The plea meant there would be no trial, no presentation of evidence to a jury, and no opportunity for Miller to contest the charges. The admission of guilt brought the legal proceedings directly to sentencing. The sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from April's family members. Multiple relatives spoke to the court about the 3 decades of pain and loss they had endured. The statements gave voice to the human cost of Miller's actions and provided the judge with insight into how the crime had affected those who loved April's cousin Christina Snyder spoke emotionally to the court. She addressed Miller directly, telling him she used the word human loosely when describing him. She called Miller an animal and a cold-hearted monster. Snyder looked at Miller and told him to burn in hell. Her words conveyed the anger and disgust that family members felt toward the man who had killed their young relative. Janet Tinsley, April's mother, also addressed the court. She told Miller that even though 30 years had passed, she still remembered the day like it was yesterday. Janet stated that Miller had ripped her family apart. She looked directly at Miller and said that he took April's life and the family wanted his in return. Janet noted that the 80 years he was receiving was far less than what he had made the family deal with over 3 decades. Janet also spoke about how Miller had thrown April's body out like it was trash. She told Miller that she would never forgive him or forgive what he took from her until the day she died. The statement reflected the permanent nature of the loss and the impossibility of true closure even with Miller's arrest and guilty plea. Prosecutor Karen Richards closed the victim impact statements. Richards became emotional while speaking to the court, crying at times as she addressed the impact of the crime. She stated that what Miller did made everyone in Fort Wayne lose their sense of safety. The prosecutor applauded the work of law enforcement across multiple agencies and decades. Richards said she agreed with the Tinsley family that she would have liked to see the death penalty applied in the case, though Indiana law and the plea agreement did not include that outcome. Miller's defense attorney read a statement on his client's behalf. The attorney said that Miller was sorry to the Tinsley family and the community. The statement acknowledged that Miller could not do anything to make up for what was lost, and that he wished it had never happened. The apology, delivered through his attorney rather than spoken directly by Miller, represented the only expression of remorse offered during the proceedings. Judge Robert Serbeck accepted the plea agreement and announced the sentence. Miller received 50 years in prison for the murder charge. He received an additional 30 years for the child molesting charge. The sentences would run consecutively rather than concurrently, meaning Miller would serve the full 80 years. The consecutive structure ensured Miller would spend the rest of his life in prison given his age of 59 at sentencing. The 80-year sentence meant Miller would be 139 years old before becoming eligible for release if he served the full term. Given average life expectancy, the sentence was effectively life in prison. Miller would be incarcerated in an Illinois Department of Corrections facility to begin serving his time. The courtroom proceedings concluded the active phase of the criminal case. Miller's guilty plea and sentencing brought legal accountability for April's death 30 years after the crime occurred. While no sentence could return April to her family or erase the decades of pain, the legal system had processed the case to its conclusion, with Miller accepting responsibility and receiving substantial punishment. Outside the courthouse, prosecutor Karen Richards and April's parents, Dave and Karen Olson, spoke briefly to media. The family's presence with the prosecutor symbolized their involvement throughout the legal process and their relief that the proceedings had finally reached an endpoint. After 30 years of uncertainty, they had witnessed the person responsible for April's death admit guilt and receive a life sentence. Detective Dan Camp received the news of John Miller's arrest with a mix of emotions after dedicating years of his professional life to finding April Tinsley's killer. Camp had carried April's photograph in his wallet for a long time, a personal commitment to remembering the child whose death he could not solve during his active years on the case. The arrest vindicated the countless hours he spent reviewing evidence and pursuing leads, even though the breakthrough came from technology that did not exist during his time working the investigation. Camp told media outlets that he planned to attend every day of Miller's trial proceedings. When Miller instead pleaded guilty, eliminating the need for a trial, Camp expressed satisfaction that the case had finally reached resolution. The detective noted that the profile investigators had developed over the years accurately described what Miller looked like and his characteristics. The decades of traditional detective work had pointed in the right direction, even without the technology to identify a specific individual. The Fort Wayne community processed the arrest and guilty plea with relief and continued sadness. April's murder had been an open wound in the collective consciousness of the city for 30 years. Parents who had become more vigilant about their children's safety after 1988 now had confirmation that the threat had been real and had lived among them undetected. The resolution brought a measure of closure but could not erase the decades of fear and uncertainty. The role of genetic genealogy in solving the case attracted significant attention from law enforcement agencies across the country. April's murder became one of the high-profile examples of how the technique could crack cold cases that traditional methods had been unable to solve. The success demonstrated the value of preserving DNA evidence even when immediate analysis did not produce results, as technology would eventually catch up to make that evidence useful. The investigation also highlighted the importance of multi-agency cooperation and persistence across generations of law enforcement officers. Detectives who worked the case in 1988 properly collected and preserved DNA evidence using the best practices available at that time. Their careful work 3 decades earlier made the 2018 arrest possible. Officers who picked up the investigation in later years maintained the case file and kept pursuing leads even as years passed without progress. The 2018 breakthrough required both the old evidence and the new technology working together. Prosecutor Karen Richards emphasized during public statements that the case had haunted Fort Wayne for 30 years. The use of that specific word captured how April's unsolved murder had lingered in the community's memory. The taunting messages left by Miller in 1990 and 2004 had added to the psychological impact, demonstrating that the killer remained free and willing to threaten other children. The arrest removed that ongoing threat and provided answers to questions that had persisted for 3 decades. Janet Tinsley and her family experienced the arrest and conviction as both an ending and an acknowledgement that nothing could truly restore what had been taken. April would not return. The 30 years of her absence could not be recovered. The trauma of losing a child to violent crime had shaped their lives in permanent ways. Miller's guilty plea and 80-year sentence represented accountability under the law. The family's grief remained. In September 2025, John D. Miller died in prison at the age of 66. He had served approximately 7 years of his 80-year sentence. His death meant he would never complete the full term of imprisonment imposed by the court. The news of Miller's death brought a final chapter to the legal aspects of the case, though for April's family, the loss they suffered in 1988 would continue indefinitely. The April Tinsley case stands as an example of how advances in forensic science can bring resolution to investigations that seemed permanently unsolved. The combination of carefully preserved evidence, persistent investigative work, and genetic genealogy technology created the breakthrough that traditional methods alone could not achieve. The case also demonstrates the lasting impact of violent crime on families and communities, and the importance of continuing to pursue justice regardless of how much time has passed. The investigation required coordination between Fort Wayne Police, DeKalb County authorities, Indiana State Police, the FBI, and multiple forensic laboratories across 3 decades. Each agency contributed expertise and resources to maintain the case file and pursue new leads as they emerged. The collective effort across jurisdictions and generations of officers exemplified how cold cases demand sustained commitment from law enforcement. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old when her life was taken in 1988. Her case remained unsolved for 30 years before science and determined police work identified the person responsible. The resolution provided answers and accountability, though it could never fully address the magnitude of the loss her family and community endured.